to Wildly Southwest, a podcast by Southwest NRM and the show where we dive deep into the landscapes, ecosystems and people shaping the environmental future of our region in this corner of Western Australia. But first, we recognise Noongar people as the traditional custodians and the first natural resource managers of this country on which we live and work. We pay our respects and acknowledge elders of this land, past and present. We are committed to working with traditional custodians to protect and care for country for the benefit of future generations. I'm your host, Christy Hitchens, and today we're again joined by the CEO of Southwest NRM and someone who has dedicated a career of 30 years to understanding, protecting and restoring our natural environment, Dr. Manda Page. Manda, it's great to have you here once again.
Thanks for having me, Christy.
Manda, today we're diving into a topic that affects every one of us, threatened species, what those terms really mean and why understanding them matters more than ever. But first, I wanted to start our conversation by getting just a little bit personal. In getting to know you over the last 3 years, there's one thing that really stands out, and that's your absolute passion for working to protect plants and animals that are at risk of extinction. Can you share with our listeners a little bit about what it is that initially fired that interest?
Thanks, Christy. Well, I always knew I loved nature. I loved being outside and I loved being in the environment. And at school, I was also very good and really enjoyed science as well. So when I was looking to go to university and decide on what sort of career I wanted, I thought I wanted to combine those things. I wanted something outdoorsy and something sciencey. So I got into conservation and environmental management. And that was a wonderful basis. And I learned a lot through that. But it wasn't until I moved to Queensland and I was doing my PhD in Western Queensland when I came across this wonderful man called Peter McRae, and he was saving bilbies. And that was it. I got to cuddle a bilby. I got to see them out in the wild in far western Queensland on the edge of the Simpson Desert. I was hooked. Bilbies.
Love it first sight.
Yeah, bilbies were it. But that program was not just about how cute bilbies are. It was about the scientists learning about bilbies. It was this last population in Western Queensland. It was about how we could save them, what we needed to, how to bring community on board, how to get the politicians on board, how to get the funding, which all culminated in us reintroducing bilbies back into another site in Western Queensland. And I was very lucky. I got to work on that as a scientist. I was a university lecturer at the time, so I used to go to Western Queensland and do research. I had students doing research on bilbies. And in my spare time, I helped the Bilby Fund raise money, raise awareness and, advocate and influence politicians and others to save bilbies and therefore save other threatened species.
Do you still have connections to that work?
I do. When I was most recently working in Queensland, I did get to back out to my old stomping ground and see the bilbies now that we reintroduced behind a fence in Currawinya and the captive breeding program we have in Charleville. So it was really lovely to see that those bilbies are alive and well and thriving actually.
It's actually hard to imagine something more satisfying than seeing outcomes like that. And from listening to you talk again about your work in Queensland, I've heard you mention another species that you worked quite similarly with, and that was the hairy-nosed wombat. I did not even know there was such a thing.
Oh, the northern hairy-nosed wombat is a most amazing animal. So we have 3 species of wombats here in Australia: the southern hairy-nosed, the common, and the northern hairy-nosed. And a lot of people would know the common wombats because they are quite prolific. But the northern hairy-nosed wombat is a unique species that is only found in Queensland, sort of central Queensland, and got down to something like 30 individuals.
Gosh.
So I don't know a species that has been on the brink of extinction more than that species. There's now well over 300, and wow. I was very lucky to have been part of a program which where we did a translocation and we established a new population of northern hairy-nosed wombats, which is so important to a species that's on the brink of extinction, because if you've only got them in one place, something happens, a fire, a disease, the whole place is wiped out. If you can have 2 populations in 2 different locations, you spread that risk and suddenly the risk of extinction is a little bit better.
From 30 to 300, that's a pretty incredible story.
It really is. I can't say that I did that on my own. I played a very small part in that, and there was a group of amazing researchers and community groups and, all sorts of people that work on that program and still do. Like it's still, it's still far away, not far away, far enough away from extinction.
You've seen what's possible, obviously, from, like you said, clinging to the edge of extinction to now a healthy population in multiple locations, which is incredible.
Two healthy populations, yeah.
So if we now turn our thoughts to the topic of today's episode, listeners, you've probably heard words like endangered, vulnerable, critically endangered. They're tossed around in the news and social media. But what do these labels actually tell us? And are they giving us the full picture of what's going on with this particular species? Manda is someone who can really help us unpack these concepts thanks to her deep experience in threatened species conservation across Australia. For 5 years, she served as the Director of Threatened Species for the Queensland Government. Before that, she spent a decade in Western Australia overseeing more than a dozen recovery programs for threatened species. Her work has focused on slowing and ideally reversing the roughly 2% annual decline in Australia's threatened species over the past quarter century. This isn't just a job for Manda, which I'm sure you can tell from listening to her talk about it. It's a mission. Manda, can you paint a picture for me of the problem we're facing when it comes to extinction in Australia?
Sure, Christy. It's a hard one. Unfortunately, Australia is well known for a really bad stat. We have the highest extinction rate on the planet. Since colonisation, more than 100 species that are found nowhere else on Earth has gone extinct, so they have disappeared forever. There's lots of reasons for that, but the important thing is that we need to recognise that today we still have almost 2,000 ecological communities and threatened species listed. So there is so many species that are still in trouble. That number doesn't even include the many, many species that we don't even know enough about to identify or to list. They may be at risk too, and therefore that number could be grossly underestimated. This isn't a niche issue. It's not just an issue in Australia. It's a national and even a global challenge that we've got to work on. Biodiversity means the variety of species, native species in our ecosystems, and it's not just a nice to have. If we don't have biodiversity, we don't have healthy landscapes. And if we don't have healthy landscapes, we won't have humans living on this planet. We all rely on them for our food systems, for our clean, healthy air and water, and for our social and physical well-being. Here in the southwest region alone, we have over 100 nationally listed threatened species, some 84 plants and 24 animals. So we've got a challenge. Let's try and do some work on threatened species. Southwest NRM, along with a really large network of funders and traditional custodians, researchers, environmental groups, community groups, and even government, has been working for over 25 years now to protect some of these threatened species. An important part of our work involves enhancing public understanding and public understanding of these issues. So I'm really hopeful that many people in our community will have an opportunity to listen to this conversation, learn a little bit more about what a threatened species is, and maybe a bit about what you can do to help.
Me too. Share this with your friends. So let's get into the terminology. What does it really mean when a species attracts the label of threatened?
So threatened is a word that we use to indicate that a species is at risk of extinction. So it means, if we think of extinction of a species falling over a cliff, it means that we're approaching the edge of that cliff. It's actually a word that is legislated in Australia. So we actually have a process for listing species as threatened. And this is very much guided by scientific evidence, and it's governed under the legislation. Here in Australia, it's the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999, which we call the EPBC Act because it's too long a word to say. The Australian government is rolling out a series of reforms to this legislation at the moment. So if you're interested, you should look into that. Western Australia also has its own list of threatened species, which comes under the Biodiversity Conservation Act of 2016. Sometimes these state and national lists don't exactly match, but there has been a program underway to unify the two lists, which is a slow process, but we're getting there.
So what actually happens with a species under that legislation once it becomes listed as threatened?
Yeah, so once a species is officially recognised that it's threatened and makes it onto the list, it triggers a number of things. Firstly, it triggers stronger protection, so stronger legal protection, which means there's greater penalties for harming or interfering with that species or its habitat. So it gives it a high elevation of protection. What the list also does is it helps government and conservation groups and others to prioritise our resources. Unfortunately, we don't have enough money to save every species. Of course, we want to save every species, but if we have to prioritise where to put our funding, this gives us an idea of what species are most at risk, so therefore maybe where we should be putting more of our efforts. Community groups, First Nations groups, NGOs, industry, we can all use this list as a help to guide us.
Does getting a species on the list, I imagine there's quite a few factors, but does it come down essentially to how many there are left? Or is it more to it than that?
There is a bit more to it than that. I mean, it basically does, because extinction means there's none left, or none left in the wild. And of course, once we get to zero, that's it. So essentially it does, but there's a number of different ways that we can measure that. So it is quite a complex set of scientific criteria that we use to assess if a species is to be listed as threatened or not. And it includes the number of animals left, but it might also include the number of populations that are left. It also looks at things like where the populations are, how widespread they are. So we term that its area of occupancy or its extent of occurrence. It also looks at the ecology of the species. So some species are going to be more inclined to going extinct just because of its behaviours or its ecological traits. Imagine a species that takes a very long time to breed, like a cockatoo or even one of our sea turtles. You know, it's 30 years before they actually have their first offspring. So they've got to live for 30 years before they can even replace themselves. So those sorts of species are actually more vulnerable because they're not churning out lots of individuals. A species that breeds very fast and has lots and lots of offspring can actually replenish its numbers more quickly. So we look at traits like that as well. So it is quite complicated, and this means that we have to have excellent scientific information and data to make these decisions, which is important. But it also means, you know, we don't always have all that information. Yeah. So realistically, we know that there are lots and lots of species that probably could be listed, but we don't have enough information yet to assess them against that complex criteria.
It's quite scary to think about that we may be grossly underestimating what is already a significant problem.
Absolutely, and especially if you look at things like, you know, insects and stuff, where we haven't even probably identified or, you know, anywhere near all the insects that we've got, let alone worked out if they're being impacted and threatened by extinction.
So once a species is listed as threatened, it's also then assigned to one of three categories: critically endangered, endangered or vulnerable. Can you explain a little bit about what's actually happening for a species when it's assigned to one of these categories?
Sure. So all that scientific information I talked about is also used to assign it to one of these categories. Basically, it's a spectrum from vulnerable through to critically endangered. Vulnerable, as it sounds, means that it's vulnerable to extinction, but it's not quite at the cliff face yet. So something that's vulnerable in compared to something that's critically endangered means it's not as at risk as extinction. It still is, and we're still really concerned, but it's not quite there. The next category is endangered, and a species is endangered again. It's a very serious situation, and it still faces a very high risk of extinction, but higher than vulnerable. And then, of course, we've got critically endangered. As it sounds, we're at critical point. These are the species that are right on the edge of that cliff, and every individual is important, and everything we do that impacts that species really has to be scrutinised. So these categories, like, they're not just labels, they actually mean something, and they talk to us about how urgently we need to act and how much support a species might need to survive. And while these categories help us prioritise, they also remind us that extinction is not inevitable. With the right interventions, with people working together, with combining science with on-ground actions, we can slow down the rate at which a species is moving to that cliff edge. And with any hope, we can downgrade things from critically endangered, too vulnerable, and hopefully one day maybe getting them off the list altogether. That's the end goal.
I was hoping to circle back to a point that you made earlier, Manda, in I think this conversation and a previous one that we had, and that was that you said preventing extinctions and maintaining biodiversity in our environment is important for human health. Can you tell me a little bit more about the connection between biodiversity and human health?
For sure. When we talk about biodiversity, people might think it's something that's separate to them. It's out in the bush, or it's out in the forest, in the wetlands, in the ocean, and it's quite a separate concept. But the fact of the matter is that our existence and human life is completely and utterly underpinned by having these healthy ecosystems, and that includes having biodiversity. So it's intrinsically linked to our survival. So let me just explain a little bit more. Healthy ecosystems regulate things that we depend on every day. It provides us with clean air, clean water, fertile soils for us to grow our crops and food, and stable climates. When we start messing with biodiversity, which results in biodiversity decline, those systems start to break down. And that has real consequences for human health and human existence. So when we talk about threatened species, we're not just talking about wildlife. We're not just talking about an individual thing that might disappear upon the planet and not have any implications. We start to break down these complex ecosystems, which underpin the health of our environment, which of course underpins our communities and our future and the future generations' future.
So for somebody listening to this conversation, they're thinking, I'm an individual, I can understand the problem that you're talking about now that I've listened to this conversation. I don't work in the environment sector. What power do I have to help create change in my local area? Mm-hmm. The scale of the problem seems overwhelming, and it's very easy to feel powerless and not be able to do anything to help change it.
Absolutely, and I understand that. It can feel overwhelming. We get hit with these information all the time. And as a result, I think we sometimes feel, it's acceptable to go, well, that's not my job, or it's not, that's nothing I can do about it. It's just happening out there. But that's not true. Everyone can play a part. We all live in this environment. We all should help to protect it. I think the biggest thing people can do is be informed. So share what you learn, listen to podcasts like this, listen to other information, join a local conservation group, pay attention to what sort of species are in your backyard. Small actions can all add up, especially when thousands and thousands of people take small actions. It really can have a massive impact.
Absolutely, that's true. So there you go. Just by listening to this podcast and being more informed, an individual is helping in a very small way. Maybe they could even take that next step by sharing this conversation with a friend or signing up to our monthly Southwest NRM e-newsletter. Thank you, Dr. Manda Page, for today and for your 30 years of dedication to environmental conservation.
Thanks for having me, Christy.
If you would like to join the community of environmentally aware folk receiving the Southwest NRM e-newsletter, just visit the website at southwestnrm.org.au. We'll also include a link to sign up in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Wildly Southwest. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend or leave us a review. It helps more people discover the show and join the conversation. Until next time, stay curious and stay connected to the world around you.
Into the wild.